You live.
Beautiful. All right. So technical session 39, other operating systems, because the world doesn't completely revolve around Microsoft Windows. There are other options out there if you so choose to explore them. The two biggest players being Linux and Mac OS. During this objective, you'll be able to explain the purpose and context for knowing how to navigate other operating systems, including Mac OS, Linux, and mobile operating systems. Compare and contrast the features and functionality of the Mac operating system and the Linux operating system. They do have a lot of similarities, especially when you get into the command line. And if you have never utilized one of these systems, definitely going to have to utilize a adaptability mindset or behavior skill when trying to work with these, so you can learn at least basic navigation to begin with, and then start diving deeper and deeper into it, depending on the level you wish to attain within the IT ecosphere, and maintain a growth mindset so that you are aware of the new iterations that are coming out each and every year with a lot of these particular programs, and how they will change your functionality when working with them. Basic overview of the operating system market as we know it today. Obviously, that biggest chunk right here, Windows 10. What is that? Does it say how much? 41.5%. The next biggest is Windows 7 with 32%. Then the next biggest is 8.1 at 4. So you're looking at, over 80% is that Microsoft ecosphere, like we kind of mentioned earlier, talked about earlier. Then you start getting into Mac operating system, which if you add up the two together, you get roughly about 8% of the market by itself. Then you get into Windows XP. You still have about 3% of people out there using it. Then Ubuntu, you finally get down to a third company, which would give you a little over 1%. So market pretty handily dominated by Microsoft even to this day. But you can kind of think of it as most markets, it's first in, best dressed is the way a lot of people like to explain it. It's the first person to the market with the most pleasing operating system or interactions will typically develop and maintain the largest portion of market share unless something else significantly better steps into the marketplace. All right. So the other operating systems that have somewhat popularity is both the Mac operating system and the Linux operating system. I think we have at least. Yes.
Yes.
I think we have at least a couple Mac users in this particular cohort. I am one myself. I do also have a Microsoft machine as well, though I do not use it quite as often. But we need to be aware of these other two and know like best practices, the names of the tools that we're going to be utilizing inside them, what features. So if somebody mentions them, you at least know off the bat. If somebody mentions the dock, they're talking about Mac, they're talking about Mac OS, and if they speak of Ubuntu, they're speaking of a Linux operating system, something along those lines. You'll need to know basic command lines to use within Linux and Mac. Thankfully, they are basically the same for most of them. And be able to do basic commands. If you guys have completed week 5 in Coursera, you have done the add, update, and delete a file in the Linux program, correct?
I think that's in test out, not in Coursera.
they do have one in Coursera.
Oh, okay.
Week 5. They have installing, updating, and removing programs in both Windows and Linux. They have 2 labs, one for each. So if you have not done that, they don't take very long, and they do a pretty good walkthrough. But many of those commands you use in there, you're going to have to remember those commands for future labs that you're going to be doing, because they won't necessarily give you every step of the way each time. Questions so far? Linux operating system. Here are the most common ones that they have out there for general use. In IT, can anybody tell me what the most common version they use is? Say if you're getting into security.
It'd be Red Hat, right?
The common version of Linux?
Yeah, isn't that the security one?
That's not the one I'm thinking. I'm not the one that is most common. Typically, it has all the security tools built right into it. Has a dragon for its icon. Kali Linux has all the tools for penetration testing, all that stuff built right into it. You can go ahead and use it. There's a couple others that you can use. I think was it Black Arch was one, but that one's a bit of a hassle trying to get it installed and up and running, from what I hear. And what'd you say? Web app was one that you've come across, Steve?
Red Hat?
Red Hat. Okay, I didn't hear exactly what you said. Red Hat is more of a general use to my understanding, but it does have some security tools built into it. And I believe Red Hat is subscription based, right?
Yeah, I thought so.
So Kali is, I believe, completely free. And really good tool. It's one of the easiest ones to get installed on a computer, even easier than Ubuntu. That's the one we would recommend if you're doing a virtual machine, to try to install it on your computer to start working with Linux. We will be offering up some extra bonus credit if you can get a virtual machine installed on your computer with Windows 7 and Kali Linux. And we'll give you the ISOs for those. I think we will be able to grant you access to the ISOs for those on a Google Drive if you're not able to find them on Google, which should be pretty easy to get through those. Questions so far? Most common one you will see out and about today for everyday use is Ubuntu. That is their most popular version to date. Although I think they're doing some pretty big changes with Ubuntu right now, coming up. All right. Mac OS versions going back to 2001. First, they were going with their big cat versions, starting with smaller cats, working their way all the way up to mountain lion, which is kind of weird because I believe mountain lions are smaller than African lions. But so they started slowly working their way from smaller to bigger, smaller to larger, excuse me. And then they moved on to mountains and moved through mountains. And I believe now they're working through state parks, and they operate either through smallest to largest, or sometimes they go, no, I don't think they go alphabetical at all. They do go smallest park to largest park. I think with the mountains, it was the shortest to the highest peaks. and they roughly come out close to about one a year. But if you see any of these names, it should trigger right away that you're dealing with a, like if you ask what operating system you're working off of, and they just say Mountain Lion, you know they're operating off of a Mac.
What do you have, Kelly?
I have, what is it, it's not High Sierra. I'm trying to think what the most recent version is. I'll have to look.
Big Sur, wasn't it?
Big Sur, yeah, whatever the most recent one is.
Big Sur.
They just came out with an update yesterday.
And for how long, Kelly? That's another thing that I forget. How long will Mac service your with updates? 10 years?
Well, what it'll do is they'll, like say, if you get a computer, I think they allow it for, you know, X amount of years, like 7 or 8 years, depending, 6 or 7, 7, 8, something. They'll allow that model to be updated to the next operating system. Once you hit a certain point, they no longer allow you to update the operating system. And then beyond that, they will give security updates and patches for the next 3 years beyond that. So it's like 10, 11 years is about the usage you can get out of an individual device and have it fully secured. Beyond that, there's other things you can do with third-party software if you so choose. I think my wife still has a MacBook Pro that is about 20 years old, still operates fully functional, like the day she got it. The only problem is the battery doesn't work anymore. We had to get it where it's basically a desktop. It has to be plugged in to work. But other than that, works just as good as the day she got it. And we use it for certain things, like if we're doing large updates to iTunes or something like that. We'll rip the files down to that computer first and then move them over. But let's see here. Better Liger.
Like giving Emmanuel a hard time.
Yeah, Liger. That's funny. All right. Other operating system maintenance you got to keep in mind when dealing with any operating system: scheduled backups, disk maintenance, regular updates, not just the main operating system, but any applications that operate within the operating system. A lot of times when you update from an older version to a newer version, like going from Leopard to Lion, it does not necessarily allow for functionality of the apps. The apps need to be continually supported to be able to be run on the newer operating system. And if you are a Mac person, you have experience at some point in time where you've downloaded third-party apps. They work great for about 3 or 4 runs, and then all of a sudden they are banished from the site, and it's a lot more difficult to get them to operate unless you go back to a previous operating system. Patch management, driver and firmware updates, all things that you would typically go through. Antivirus and anti-malware, which unfortunately has a tendency to be neglected on Macs because of the prevailing myth that they are immune to viruses, but we talked about that earlier. Any questions so far? Again, this is mostly just a 10,000-foot view of these two things, these two main operating systems, just to kind of make sure that they're in your peripherals so that you can at least understand it when somebody's mentioning it, things like that. Now, in Linux, they can be scheduled using the, a lot of things within Ubuntu and most Linux operating systems. They tend to rely pretty heavily on the command line. They're doing a lot more with the GUI interfaces, but still for many tasks, you still need to go back to the command line to function. The menu you're going to be opening and utilizing for backups in Linux is rsync, and the utility will open up. You can type manual and it will tell you all the fun information about that utility, tell you how to use it, give you all the information on it. If there's ever a utility you come across, you don't know what it does, Linux gives you the opportunity to basically read the manual for whatever utility you're trying to work with. And as with any command file, you can create batch files and schedule the backups as you see fit and need. Tar and Scipio will allow for partial or full backups if you want to schedule them that way as well. Although from what I've heard from people, most people tend to rely heavier on the rsync. Mac operating system. You can, if you want to go into the command line in Mac, you can use the rsync, but most people aren't necessarily going to operate in the command line on Mac operating systems. They will typically use the Time Machine utility, which is pretty upfront and center when you install the operating system or when you turn it on for the first time. It'll even ask you if you want to go ahead and turn that on, set up regular updates, schedule your backups, and it's pretty user-friendly from that point. It is not automatically enabled. It is something you actively would need to enable, much like System Restore in Windows. Same thing. You can perform backups at whatever frequency you want to set it up, hourly, daily, weekly, however, best fits your needs. But understand when backups are occurring, they take up processing power. So you need to understand that if you're going to be running backups, especially during the day, it is going to take away from your availability, your available processing power to do other tasks. So it can slow your systems down. Utility requires booting to a different drive to perform an operation on the drive in question. Questions so far? The difference between Linux and Mac backups. Yep. Disk maintenance. Regularly checking your disks for errors. I'm not fully familiar with Linux. I'm gonna, offer that one up right off the bat. I was not a huge Linux person, although I am working on trying to get certified in it by the end of the year. So in Linux, the main command line you would use to check the system for errors, make sure everything's functioning properly, all your file systems have not been corrupted or changed, would be FSCK, File Systems Checker. And then Apple systems does not require defragmentation. That is more likely because they have solid state disks. Then, they are immune to that kind of stuff. And also you can check your disk health using the Disk Utilities Verify Disk within the toolbar menu that you have at the bottom, also called Dock. And you don't have to boot to a different drive. It's something you can just verify while functioning in the system. Questions so far?
Mr. Kelly, can you repeat the abbreviations of for the Linux OS, the FISC?
It's FSCK, File Systems Checker.
File Systems Checker. Got it. Thank you.
File Systems Checker. That would be the command line you would want to run to make sure that the drive is functioning properly. If there are any heavy Linux users out there, feel free to chime in at any point. Share your experience. I'm definitely interested. We did have a big Linux user in the previous cohort, as well as one of our other TAs was actually working on and then got certified in Linux Plus during that particular cohort. Now, if you did, was it week 5 for Coursera for the intro to tech support, you ran this update here in the command line so that you were able to update, was it is the video LAN, VLN. You're able to update the VLN by basically running an update on the system and updating all the background apps in the system. So you're able to do that in the command line, although Ubuntu and Fedora allow updates within the GUI tools as well. You can go through, check and see if any are available to be upgraded. You can do them all at once or individual select. And the command line in Ubuntu, if you did the lab they had, will look familiar, which is right here. Sudo apt-get update. Does anybody understand why they would put sudo here and what that means? They did describe it briefly in Coursera. Yes, Emmanuel.
It gives you basically admin permissions.
Exactly.
Super user do, or something like that.
What does the do mean?
I don't remember.
So there's su, which is su, or sudo, which is the sudo. So su, as Emmanuel just explained, is super user, and it gives you administrative privileges within the Linux program. Do stands for do once. That means you're not turning on the super user function and leaving it on. You're using it one time to perform one task, and that is generally the one you're going to want to gravitate towards, because you don't want to accidentally leave administrative authority on the computer. So you would use the sudo, super user do once, and then apt-get update. All right, Apple Store provides updates directly to your apps for mobile devices and for on the computer, and they can automatically be applied through the software update preferences if you want it to kind of happen in the background and not really have to pay attention to it. Or you can do manual updates if that is your preference. All right. Patch management, driver firmware updates. Both Mac and Linux use the same tool to manage patches as Windows, System Center Configuration Manager, or SCCM. Or if you so choose, you can use third-party tools to manage it if you wish. Some people prefer that. They feel it gives them more control over what they're upgrading and what they're managing. Some people just figure to stick with the ingrained systems already available. Now, when somebody says Linux operating system, does this work? Does this work? Unfortunately, a lot of times the answer is it depends. It depends on the different versions you're using, whether or not these tools will apply. Some of them are pretty standard across the board. Some of them are not. So driver and firmware, you can do it during or after install. Software Update Center is the most common one, or the Personal Package Archive, which are basically big repositories that have, most of the basic drivers, and you can run updates to update those drivers from time to time, as we saw in the previous page. An update to an RPM package specified by the hardware vendor for Red Hat. I am not familiar with Red Hat at all. I don't think I've actually ever used that one. The only two versions I've used of Linux is Kali and Ubuntu currently. Now, firmware driver updates for Apple, they keep it all located at their basically main website at the Apple support site. You can Google it, go right to it. and run your updates from there if you wish. Questions so far? All right. Antivirus and anti-malware updates. So far, they say basically all versions of antivirus and malware are created for both Linux and Mac, just like Windows. There's the myth we were talking about. So they didn't have to worry about virus protection, but they recently have become susceptible as well. We talked about there was two reasons, and the first reason was they didn't really have a big, market presence. Does anybody know what the second reason why Mac appeared to be immune to viruses? Actually has to do with how it loads their programs or downloads them and installs them versus how a Microsoft computer would do it.
The App Store?
No, doesn't have to do with the App Store, actually. This would be pre-App Store is the reason why.
So did it used to actually be like immune to viruses?
They weren't, it's not that they weren't immune, it gave the appearance of immunity. Now, to my understanding, when you send information in for a Microsoft computer, say you're sending a program over the internet or downloading it or whatever, it's coming in thousands of different little pieces called packets, and it's throwing them all in where they think they should go, without regard to, the whole picture. It's just kind of inserting it in that, very kind of chaotic form as it's coming in. And that allows for some gaps for some nefarious programs to kind of slip in along with it, like Trojan horses or whatnot, because, of how the pieces are kind of assembled. With Mac, the way it would happen is like all the code would come in, and as it's coming in, it's putting it in line by line. It starts at point A and works down the line. It does not put everything in random order until the whole piece is put together, and then bam, you have your big chunk. It's putting everything in line by line, and if one line does not fit or match, it would give a hard stop right there and not allow the program to upload. This particular function made it a little more complicated for viruses to be uploaded to the system. So it was one of those things. It is a small market, and it's a little more complicated to get viruses to upload. So why would we focus our attention here when we can turn our eyes to the Microsoft users and have access to 85% of the market, and it's not as difficult to get what we want into the system. But tides are shifting on that. So it's becoming more and more worthwhile for them to start attacking the Mac operating systems. All right. Questions so far? Yes, Will.
For the antivirus for the Mac OS program. So just so I can follow up on what you just explained, you're saying, I understand that it's not as the scales of it's not highly popular in the market right now compared to Windows. Well, it is, but it's not as much. It's not in high demand as Windows. But other than that, what was the reason that you mentioned? Because it's what is it doing when it's
it's mostly, I mean, this isn't really for the 8+, it's just kind of the way it was described to me. Okay. It's the way that the applications are loaded in, as opposed to being like random, the packets being thrown out like a puzzle and being put in chunks. And, you could have a chunk from the end, a chunk from the beginning, and they're all kind of being put in there. And then eventually you have a full picture, and they're doing that for the case of, for speed. Mac uploads with the programs are going in line by line, so it's slower. But if something is there that is not supposed to be there, it would be a hard stop on that install. System would go, nope, that's not correct, either reattempt or it will not be allowed to upload. And so it would have been trickier for them to try to get viruses on the system that way versus the way Microsoft did it. Microsoft opted for speed. Mac did this, I think, more for program stability. It wasn't necessarily a security thing. I think the security thing was a byproduct of what they did for app stability.
Okay, so going line by line, installing the apps, or it would stop on the app that was being installed on the Mac OS. Okay.
Yeah.
Capiche.
So,
Thank you.
like I said, I think it was more for app stability, but security ended up being a byproduct of that. All right. There we go. The various things that we were just talking about, backup, time machine, store or snapshot, image recovery, disk maintenance utilities, shell terminal, screen sharing, and force quit. All right, backup tools essentially are available for all versions. There's the tar and Scipio command utilities that you can use if you wish for full or partial backups. Each utility is going to essentially create a very large file, to archive, and you can either have that stored locally on your current drive or have backups stored to external drives if you so choose, or other hard drives within the system. Linux is really great at being, for like forensic copies of drives and stuff like that, where you can make a exact bit by bit copy of a drive relatively easily. So a lot of times in security, digital forensics and stuff like that, if that's stuff you start getting interested in, you will be using the Linux tools a lot more frequently. Although I will give a word of warning, if you download Kali and you start trying to test those tools, only test them locally on your current network and let people know what you're doing. If there's more, other people in your network that you're kind of doing stuff, let them know what you're doing. Do not go poking around other people's networks with the security tools like the port scanners and stuff like that. They have a tendency to really get upset when somebody does something like that, and they might send some very unpleasant gentlemen with suits to come talk to you. So be careful when fooling around with Kali Linux. Only operate on your local network with it. Don't go poking around outside. All right. Backup, time machine, pretty straightforward. Basically, if it's off, you want it on, click it on. You can select where you want the backups to go into your options and select how often you want the backups to occur, hourly, monthly, daily, biannually, however often you want to get it set up. Make sure you have the available disk space to accomplish this. And at that point, it kind of runs in the background and you don't necessarily need to worry about it, but you should check on it from time to time. I always suggest testing your backups from time to time, make sure that it is occurring as you think it is, and that the drives you're storing to are not failing or not able to, recover from those drives. So occasionally test the data on there, make sure it's good. That way, if you do run into an accident where you actually need those backups, you're not unpleasantly surprised that the backups don't work. I just ran across this. Was that last cohort that they had the Dallas freeze, Marvin?
It was because our guy in Texas was out for a couple of days. What's his name? No, that was Catalyst.
That was Catalyst?
Everybody was in New Orleans for the most part. So yeah, that was the Catalyst one.
Well, no, Delgado had people all over.
Did they?
Yeah, no, I think
I
it
see
was
his face, but I can't tell you. It was Delgado. You're right.
Yeah. Well, at that time, my sister works for an international company, very large corporation, branch offices everywhere. And they decided they wanted to keep all of their data storage from all these locations in one place. They did not have a well, they did have a backup plan. So they had their main server farm in Dallas, Texas. So you guys remember that, what was it, a couple months ago, they had that real hard freeze in Dallas and it shut down the whole city in Texas, you know, and big parts of Texas, basically unable to function or move. Well, the corporate building for this office was an older building, pipes froze, pipes burst, and flooded the server rooms. And whoever designed the server rooms did not put the servers on a raised floor. So all this stuff was sitting right on the floor. All that water comes pouring in, destroys all of their servers. Then they go to retrieve their backups. They replace a lot of the equipment. It was about, I think it was like a little over half the equipment had to be completely replaced. So they go ahead, they replace the equipment, and they go to get the data backups that they had been sending off site. Well, during this past several years, nobody had been looking at the backups and actually testing whether the backups were good. So they wiped out all their servers. They go to get their backups, which had all of their sales data, customer info, vendor info, accounts payable, accounts receivable, who owes them money, who they owe money to, all that stuff wiped out in a single night. And then the backups that they had running, they had various levels of backups wherever they were sending them to another offsite location. They never actually verified whether the information was making it there and actually still viable. So no backup testing was ever done, and they couldn't recover anything. All they had were the data that was stored locally at each facility for the last 24 hours. That's it. So they're basically having to rebuild from scratch. And I asked her, I was like, what was your IT department doing? This is basics. If you're not on a raised floor, I mean, that's good. There's multiple reasons for that. Ventilation, like why aren't they testing this? And she's just like, yeah, those are a lot of the questions that are being asked right now. So I imagine about a third to 2/3 of their IT department's basically going to get wiped out after, the dust settles from this.
Yeah, I was about to ask you, Kelly, what's the over under of how many people get fired? I said it at like 5.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be the CIO, Chief Information Officer. He's gone.
Yeah, he can't.
Any of the
can't avoid
directors
this
below him, all that stuff. I told him I was available for CIO if they, they want to amend the hours. But haven't gotten a call back yet. Oh well, I'm still waiting. We'll see.
Yeah, a lot of people got fired from that one.
Yeah, and it's a facility that you probably know really well there, Jermaine.
For Hood?
APHIS.
Ah, wow. APHIS?
Yep.
Man, I wish they took out my damn little money I owed them.
So I don't know how much was recoverable, like once they got drives up and running. I just remember having that conversation with, I was like, oh man, that is catastrophic. So it'll be interesting to see the fallout on it.
There are people who are not even supposed to check that line of work. So even the management level is like, hey, that's not my job. He's getting cut too.
Probably.
Like, oh, well, you're supposed to.
But yeah, so I mean, but they, the moral is essentially doing a backup isn't enough. You got to verify that the backup's good.
But I thought that redundancy would already been put in, where if you have a storage, you'll always check to see when's the last time you backed up A, B, is it actually backing up? Isn't that
was my first question is who was testing the backups? And they said no, They did a couple tests when they first started doing the automatic ones. Those came back good and they stopped testing.
So you got to have a protocol, and clearly they were not. They did not have a great protocol with that. You just can't assume something is happening because it happened once. You got to do some checks and balances there.
So
I mean, they've
I'm
done a
guessing
lot of
that
rebuilding and
sorry.
data recovery, but we'll see. They're using a lot of the satellite locations to rebuild their data. So, in any case. All right. Restore points, snapshots. Snapshots essentially is creating an image of the drive for you at that particular point in time. All the settings and applications you have, just kind of like a real brief, quick shot in time. You can go back to, if you want, goes back to previous versions and just has all those settings in place. Now on Linux, the command you would use to run to go back to a previous snapshot you had in place is the IV convert. Then you can add the -s argument to create a snapshot at that particular point. Now, for Time Machine, you would select it, you go enter Time Machine to go back in time, and you'll be taken to the Time Machine window where you can actually navigate, and then you can click which restore point you actually want to go back to. And at that point, it will take you back to that particular point. Which again, good to do prior to any major updates, just in case it has negative impacts on applications or system usage, especially in an enterprise environment. Questions so far?
These are the same thing as system restore, just different name.
Basically, yes. A lot of these things, the main key is kind of just knowing the different names they use for the same basic applications, and understand that when somebody's talking about Time Machine, they're talking about a Mac. When they're talking about Doc, they're talking about a Mac, and just basically knowing the differences of those three. They tend to operate pretty similar between them. Yes, Apple likes fancy names, but they tend to serve the same functions and operate in similar manners. All right, image recovery. Both of them kind of use similar techniques. As you can see here, you can use the rsync utility within Linux, which was also the same one you would use to create that snapshot or backup. And in Mac operating systems, you would do this through disk utility along with the backup and the OS media. Questions so far? All right. Disk maintenance and disk utility. Kind of does what it says, performs disk-related tasks in Mac operating system, including the creation, conversion, compression, and the encryption of disks. Both systems can recover the image using the same techniques as restoring a single file, but they can do it for the entirety of the drive. And below, as you can see, there are a couple different tools or utilities you can use to back up and restore. rsync for Linux. You can also use it in Mac if you want to operate in the command line. Does anybody know what the command line in a Mac operating system is called? It's the same as in a Linux.
That is terminal, I think.
Terminal. You are correct. All right, Time Machine, Mac specific. File systems checker works on both disk utilities, Mac specific, tar for Linux, and Ivy create is also Linux. Questions so far? If you're able to create a virtual machine with Kali, highly recommend getting in there and messing around with the command line. If you end up breaking it, you just re-upload the image and start over. It's kind of like in test out. If you end up breaking the simulation or getting so far out of whack that you can't fix it, you can always just start the simulation over, everything resets, and you're good to go. But if you're unfamiliar with a lot of these, I don't know. I'm sure you can. Yeah, I'm sure they do have VM ISOs for Mac OS as well that you can find out there for free.
Yeah, I'm sure you can run Mac on Windows. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can do a Hackintosh. Yes, I'm talking about just like free versions for virtual machines.
Interesting. I'm sure it exists though, Kelly. You're right.
Yeah. All right. And here it is. As we just asked this question. For Mac, it's called terminal. Linux, called shell. The CLI or command line interface. And you use the terminal to interact with the shell and the interpreter between the operating system. So both, pretty much anything you can do in GUI, you can do in CLI if you know the commands. A lot of people, when they get comfortable in command line interface, they tend to prefer operating in there just because, you know, to them it's more efficient. They're not having to jump around, use their mouse, get clogged up in other menus, run multiple search functions. They can just run those commands back to back in CLI, and it operates very quickly. In Linux, you get to the terminal by pressing Control-Alt-T. Or I think you can run a search for the terminal. In Mac, you can run a search for terminal in the Finder or follow the map here, devices, applications, utilities, terminal, and get you to the terminal, opens up a window where you will have access to it. Questions so far? All right. Screen sharing. So in Linux, they do have some third-party applications you can utilize to make this, you know, pretty easy. Some, you know, a lot of people have built free programs you can download just to kind of make it pretty, you know, point and click accessible. Or you can go through this long list of commands as a root user in order to use your screen share. If you get into the terminal or you set up the VM, it's a good exercise just to kind of run through this real quick, see if you can make it happen. In Mac, they make it a lot easier. It's similar to Windows in that sense. It enables you to share your screen or create an extended desktop through other Mac devices if you so wish. And while you're sharing your screen, essentially, for other person who is looking at it, will see the exact same thing you are doing, much like we are doing right now with Zoom. As you can see, pretty much everything I do on this particular screen of my computer. Questions so far? Force quit. If you ever run across an app that won't stop trying, it freezes up, won't do anything, can't get it to maneuver anyways, basically you're left with one option, which is to force quit. Causes it to cease running and shut down immediately to stop unresponsive programs. On the Apple menu, you can hit quit. If it still doesn't quit, you hit it, you go to that menu again, and it'll give you the option to force quit. Or you can just press Command Option Escape while selected on that, and it'll knock it out right away. In Linux, you have to go into the command line, open up the terminal, and then you would then hit kill, and then use the PID number, which every application that is opened up has its own individual PID number, which is right here. You can see what I'm pointing at. So if you have 20 iterations of Mozilla Firefox up and one of them is frozen, you could kill that individual instance of Firefox without killing all of Firefox. So even if you have 20, each one of that 20 will have its own individual PID number, which you can look up in the terminal. Questions so far?
Hey, Zay, get out of there.
Yeah.
Get out of there, man.
My bad, my dog got into something.
You're all right, man. All right. Mac features. Mission control allows you to kind of switch easily between different windows. Like if your whole desktop is really clustered and you want to jump between various programs, it allows for an easy way to do this. Let me stop share. I can just kind of show it real quick. And let's see here. Go ahead, show my current desktop real quick. You can see everything here. Essentially, mission control is everything's kind of clustered here. It's hard to see everything. You can run your hands up and it minimizes everything to a point where you can see exactly which one to operate on. Click on it, brings it to the forefront for you. So it's a really nice, quick and easy feature to switch between apps. So you're not having to search for everything, looking in the taskbar down at the bottom. You just boom, find what you want, select it, move on with your life. Makes it a lot easier if that was visible to everybody. Also, if you so choose, you can create multiple desktop instances. So you can have, like, if you can set one up, say like for work, one for leisure, one for the kids, if you want to do that. And then you can just switch between those individual desktops that could have different applications, different programs running, all that fun stuff. It's just an easy way to kind of change the pace if you so choose to set that up. It's just some of the features that Mac has. The other one is Keychain, which is their version of the password management system. So if somebody mentions Keychain, that should automatically indicate they are talking about Mac or an iPhone. Spotlight is what they call for with their search function. It's a little magnifying glass at the top rather than, was it Windows Explorer? They use Spotlight to look for things. iCloud is their version of the cloud that we had mentioned earlier. What is Google's?
Google Drive.
Google Drive. What's Microsoft's?
OneDrive.
OneDrive. There we go. All right, we're getting there. Gestures. The multi-touch touchscreen allows for a lot of added functionality to the applications you're using on the desktop, like to get to the Mission control. The gesture for that is 3 fingers on the pad, swipe it up really quickly, and it brings it up. If you only do 2, it's scrolling. So it just offers, you know, various things. Everybody's kind of getting used to them, like on Android and all that stuff, where you pinch for zoom, and, you know, 2 fingers scrolling, dragging down from the upper right corner to bring down menus, various things like that. We get used to them over time, but that was one of the initiating factors on Mac, but have become significantly more adopted across other platforms. The dock, that is the section down at the bottom of the computer. That's where all the apps are stored. It's in the same place as the taskbar on a Microsoft computer, but that's where everything is that you can click on and open up. You can have as many apps stored there as you want, or remove a bunch just to get them down to a few if you so choose. But basically that's where it's like the pinned apps in the taskbar for Microsoft. It's where the things you use the most are going to be stored. If you don't use things a lot, you can go ahead and remove them so it doesn't look so clustered. Finder, looks like a little blue and white face. And that is where you would go to look for files if you don't know quite where they're located. And it operates similar to the library on Microsoft, where you're going in and you can break it down by media type, like if you want to look at videos, pictures, music, stuff like that, or, you know, documents or what have you. And it kind of brings all that stuff together, where regardless of where it's located, into a single place. Boot camp. This is if you want to set up a multi-boot system on a Mac. This is the program you would have to run, Boot Camp. Well, at the time of the tests writing, it was called Boot Camp. Boot Camp is actually kind of on its way out. They're using a program called Parallel now to allow you to run, you know, either Linux or Mac OS on a Mac computer. And you can go ahead and partition the drive and set it up so that you select the boot, you know, which drive you want to, or operating system you want to move into. Right when you start it up, you can go ahead and select it, move right into it. And I can run Windows on here, Linux, whatever, as long as I have the RAM and storage capabilities. Questions so far? All right. Basic Linux commands. I would take a screenshot of this particular screen. Become very familiar with these commands. Some of these, they like to kind of trick you up on them, but these basic ones you definitely want to have in your mind, and they're going to be very, very similar when you use them on a Mac as well.
Could you screen share, Mr. Kelly?
Do what? Can I share my screen? No.
Please.
I figured somebody was going to tell me at some point. This is critical for your exam. Moving on. All right. Sharing is caring, as Marvin always says. Here we go. This kind of gives you the command and just a basic indicator as to what that command does. Yes, A+ does want you to know command line interface, and they do have performance-based questions where they will ask you to do things in the command line, you know, in a troubleshooting sense and repairing an issue as well. And they disable the help function. So, you know, so if you think you're going to get there and be like, oh, I can't remember the command, I'll just hit help or the question mark, whatever, and it brings it up. No, that's disabled. They will only allow you a limited amount of commands to be able to utilize, and you need to know the right ones to be able to type in. So definitely want to make flashcards for these commands here. Questions so far? You will have opportunity to use a lot of these in Test Out. They do have a whole section on Linux, I believe. And they have some good videos and labs to go along with it. Here's another section of them. If you did the lab, you've already used the apt-get. DD, that is the bit-to-bit transfer of a drive, creating essentially a exact duplicate. And this is typically, if they're going to be doing a forensic copy of a drive, they will utilize these commands if they don't already have very specific software to do it. So they will create a copy of the drive and then hash that drive so that you know if any changes have been made. Questions? All right. Now, this is the big one here. This is the one they love to use to trip you up. I'm going to give you a good heads up on this one. Right here. So you have pass WD to change password. Now, if we go back, down here, PWD is print working directory. So they will give you a series of commands and ask you, how do you change your password? Do not get confused with PWD and pass WD. That is a big one. As well as they like to ask about change modify, which will change the permissions of a file, and change or ch own, which is changing the ownership of a group. Questions so far? So pass WD. And then we talked about this one earlier. We had SU for super user and SUDU for super user do once. And this would be if you needed to do something on the administrative level in Linux. Questions? All right. Yes, Will.
Can you I think you repeated it a couple of slides ago, but I just want to make sure again. What does do stand for?
Do once.
Do once. Okay, got it.
So super user, do once. So if you're going to use an administrative level command, you would need to use SU or SUDU at the beginning of that command line so that it knows you're elevating your authority to be able to perform whatever action you're wanting to do. Otherwise, it'll just tell you you do not have authority to do this. Now in Windows, if you want to do this, you want to do administrative level stuff, you actually, before you even go into the command line, you have to right click on the applet for command line and basically run as administrator. And then you would need to have the administrative password to be able to launch that instance of it so that you could actually function as an administrator in the command line in Windows. I think they'll show that a little bit later as well in a different technical session. We'll get into that. Questions? All right. These are basically arguments you can add to the end of a particular command if you so choose. U typically means user, G group, O others, A all. And then you obviously have your plus for adding, minus for subtracting, equal to assign, and S to set user ID. And then permissions, read, write, execute. Which you would use for file permissions. Questions so far? All right. Quick quiz. Go through real quick. I believe Lazaro created this particular one, so if it here, Podlink, hold on.
Quick to the draw there, Kelly.
It's easy when the first thing that when you log back in was the Nearpod. Apple Store, very good, very good. Next, in Linux operating system environment, what command will display the current directory to the user?
Check directory.
PWD.
So PWD. That's PWD.
PWD. CD does not mean check directory. What does CD mean? It's the same as in
Change
Windows.
directory.
change
Change
directory.
directory.
Change directory. So you're
Are
on
you
the
gonna
right
share your
path
screen?
there, Jermaine. Huh?
Are you able to share right now, or you don't want to share right now?
I'm not sharing right now. Right. this second.
Okay. Okay.
Oh,
So PWD, print working directory. What are we not to get that confused with?
Pass WD.
There you go. Pass WD, which says what?
Forgot.
Password.
Use the
Change your
password.
Change your password. Definitely reiterate that one in your mind. All right, what is the name of the area at the bottom of a Mac OS screen where by default all the crucial icons would be located?
Doc.
Dock. Very good. All right. Which Linux command can be used to let you run a single command as another user? Only one time.
Yeah, sudo.
Sudo. Can anybody tell me what ifconfig would give you?
Maybe network configuration, IP address.
Very
MAC
good. Network
address, yeah.
configuration. What would we use to get that in the command line on Windows?
That is
IP config.
IP config.
IP config. And if we wanted just the wireless,
No idea.
IW config. I didn't actually expect you guys to know that one. I was just extra bonus points on that one. I saw you, Manuel. I know you got it. So, basic commands to kind of just help you maneuver around in the command line. Which Linux utility can be used to check and repair disks?
Fisk.
What is it?
Fisk.
No, I thought it was check this.
File system checker.
Oh, let's check this.
Yeah, FSK.
Okay, where would you use? Okay, for those who chose FSCK, where would you use check disk?
That is for Linux, FSK. And
There you go.
yeah, check disk for Windows.
Check disk for Windows. FSCK for Linux and Mac.
That's no fair.
Again, they like to change the names up just to be, you know, different, I guess. Although they are starting, excuse me, starting to merge a lot of the command line stuff into the same nomenclature on each side. I believe more recent iterations of terminal, they're moving towards the IP config as well as Linux, and starting to use similar commands so that it's easier, you know, to jump back and forth between them. But pretty good job, everyone. Most of them got majority of them. Yeah, everybody had a majority of them right. That is great. Excellent. Now,
Oh, you remembered.
at the end of this particular one, we should be able to explain the purpose and context for knowing how to navigate other operating systems, including macOS and Linux. Didn't really get into mobile operating systems. We will get into that in another tech session. Compare and contrast the features and functionalities of the Mac operating system and Linux operating systems. Does anyone have any questions so far with what we've covered?